And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome aboard. I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Friday, February 28, 2025. And starting with Thursday's sea ice, we find that the northern portion of the Bering Sea has extensive ice in place. There may be still yet a little bit of a southwestward drift of the ice edge here toward St. Matthew, but other than that, we find more in the way of some open water in Bristol Bay and still a little bit of ice in portions of Upper Cook Inlet. But temperatures out around this area of South Central are going to be on the mild side over the weekend and continuing into next week as we anticipate above normal temperatures across much of the state, but especially centered on areas of South Central, northward, and potentially into the Panhandle. So the weather pattern overall, we're looking by Saturday. We have a low that's weakening. This was all part of an initial system. Still have a few lingering rain and snow showers along the Gulf Coast into the Panhandle. Not quite the organized rain and snow as what we've seen for especially Thursday night into the day Friday. Then another low is going to be coming up out of the North Pacific, crossing the lower half of the Alaska Peninsula. And this is going to keep some areas of light to moderate snow going, especially in through the southwest interior on up into areas of the Seward Peninsula. And as we go into Sunday, yet another low will be coming up from the North Pacific, but most of the precipitation confined to the western areas, northern and western areas of the Gulf, and then out across areas of the southwest and western interior, as well as along the coast. But again, more like areas of light to occasionally some moderate snow. The overall pattern, though, as we get into next week, and especially by next weekend, we're going to see the weather systems, instead of coming from the North Pacific and tracking northward, they're going to be more southwest to northeastward moving. So that'll be the change coming up, but still we anticipate milder than normal conditions across especially the southern half of the state. And looking at the marine forecast, Saturday, interchannel, southeast winds 10-15 knots, waves a couple of few feet at best, Lynn Canal down through Stevens Passage. We're looking at waves as perhaps high 9-10 feet, Dixon Entrance outside of Metlakatla. For areas of Sitka south to southeast winds 15 to 20 knots with 15-foot waves. Easterly winds from outside the icy strait on up to Cape Suckling 25 to 30 knots, waves 15 to 17 feet. On Sunday, those winds coming down. Southeast winds 10 knots there, Stevens Passage on up through Lynn Canal. Northwesterly 10 knots, couple of foot waves there around Ketchikan, Metlakatla. For areas of the outer coast, kind of a mixed bag of winds, generally around 10 to 15 miles an hour. With waves around 10 feet or so. More of an easterly flow there outside of Yakutat Bay and as high as 25 knots off of Cape Suckling with 9-10-foot waves. For the northwestern Gulf on Saturday, winds are northeasterly 10 knots within Prince William Sound, just a couple foot waves. Winds have come down all along outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance down to the east side of the Kenai Peninsula. Generally east winds 15 to 20 knots. We might find some winds of 20 knots at Kennedy Entrance into Kamshak Bay with waves of 5 to 6 feet. On Sunday, a little bit more in the way of wind, not much, but generally easterly winds, 20 knots within Prince William Sound with 3-4 foot waves. Easterly winds 25 knots, again, outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance, all the way down along the Kenai coast into lower and middle Cook Inlet. And we're looking at waves off the Kenai there, about 10, 11 feet, and maybe 5, 6 feet there through the lower half of Cook Inlet. For Kodiak Island Saturday, look for southwest winds 15 to 25 knots. As we have this area of low pressure, or kind of a trough on the west side of it, winds will be northeasterly 20 to 25 knots either side there of Cold Bay and False Pass. Waves on the North Pacific side 5 to 7 feet and 3-4 feet, 3 to 5 feet there on the Bering side. For Sunday, southeast to east winds in the vicinity of Kodiak Island, waves could be as high as 12-13 feet there in the nearshore waters on the east side of the island. Shelikof Strait, 6-foot waves. And as we go down the middle and lower portion of the peninsula, winds will be northerly at 20 to 25 knots. Waves 8 feet or so on the North Pacific side, 6 to 9 feet on the Bering. Across the Aleutians on Saturday, eastern and central Aleutians generally northeast winds as high as 25 knots around Dutch Harbor on Alaska. 15 to 25 knots as we go westward through Nikolsky to Atka to Adak, and then west of Adak, north winds 20 to 25 knots. Those come back around to the west-southwest at 15 knots between Kiska and Shemya. And then on Sunday, winds will generally be out of the northeast across the eastern Aleutians at 20 to 25 knots, becoming more easterly at Atka to Adak at 25 knots, and then southeast winds Adak through Shemya at 30 to 35 knots. Along areas of the southwest coast, we have west winds 15 knots within Bristol Bay on Saturday, northwest winds Kuskokwim Bay, and then along areas from Norton Sound down along the lower Yukon coastline, we're looking at northwest to west winds 15 knots, but just variable winds around 10 knots in the vicinity of St. Matthew and the Pribilofs, with waves there pretty insignificant, 1 to 2 feet. And then for Sunday, still find more of a northwest to north flow, 15 to 20 knots, Norton Sound down along the lower Yukon coast. And then north winds to 25 knots out of Kuskokwim Bay, north winds 15 knots out of Bristol Bay, and north winds in the vicinity of the Pribilofs there with 6-foot waves, and you can see that weak low circulation in the vicinity of St. Matthew. Now for the Bering Strait, winds are generally going to be northerly at 20 knots, extending down to the north side of St. Lawrence Island. As we go up along the Chukchi Sea coast, Saturday we find east-northeast winds, especially from Point Hope, Cape Lisburne, on up to Wainwright, and then along the Beaufort Sea coast between Utqiagvik and Kaktovik, northeast winds 10 to 15 knots. And for Sunday, those winds may pick up a bit more from the east up there along the Beaufort Sea coast. Kaktovik to Utqiagvik, east winds 20 knots. Off of Wainwright, we're looking at 25-knot easterly winds. Typically, this region here is a bit breezier. And then as we drop on down through the lower Chukchi Sea, winds flip around to the west at 10 knots, and then passing through the Bering Strait, they become northerly again on the west side of the Seward Peninsula and St. Lawrence Island at around 10 knots for Sunday.